in the chat. Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. My name is Federica Cherubini and I'm the Head of Leadership Development at the Institute. Today's speaker is Simge Andı, Research Fellow and one of the authors of the Digital News Report. And Simge will talk about a chapter from the report on how people get the news about climate change. Short housekeeping before starting with the presentation. After this intro, Simge will show her presentation and we will mute everyone, every microphones and every cameras. You can always post a question in the chat at any moment throughout the presentation. At the end of Simge's presentation, I will read the question out and moderate the Q&A with Simge, and the webinar will last more or less an hour. Simge, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Federica, and hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to be talking about the chapter we wrote on climate change. Let me just begin my presentation. Okay. So Digital News Report, I think I'm the first one to do a DNR webinar this year, and this is quite exciting and terrifying at the same point. But today's subject is how people access news about climate change. And our main motivation, I should begin by explaining our main motivation for writing a chapter on news and climate change, I guess. We've seen, in the last couple of years, we've seen an increasing interest in both public and political interest in climate change. We've seen strikes, we've seen next generation leaders like Greta Thunberg being very vocal, and young people following her and some other activists who are also participating in these demonstrations. At the same time, we've been observing more and more frequently extreme weather events, hurricanes, wildfires, bushfires. It's been these are becoming more and more disastrous around the globe. And while we have these increasing concerns and also increasing weather events, we also have groups of people who are not really interested, or they're just like refusing the idea of climate change, and they're probably refusing to pay any attention to it. But as the subject matter is quite important in this year's DNR, we wanted to explore a couple of things, which I will mention in a second. So we asked a couple of questions in this year's DNR, which we conducted in 6 continents across 40 markets with more than 80,000 respondents. And what did we want to understand in this year's DNR? We first wanted to understand the level of concern about climate change. So do people care? Are they referring to climate change as a serious issue or not? And then we wanted to understand the news sources they use or they pay the most attention to when it comes to climate change, because there is a big role of the news media affecting public concern on climate change. And finally, we also wanted to understand how well people think the news media are performing in providing information about climate change, but also helping people understand what they can do about climate change. So what did we find? We found, first of all, are people concerned? We found that the majority of our respondents, they are concerned because we found that 69% of our respondents in our survey say that climate change is an extremely or very serious problem. As you can see in the chart, of course, there is some variation across markets. For instance, when you look at countries on the left side of the graph, you'll see the countries with the highest proportion of respondents who are most concerned about climate change. And these are mostly from the global south, like Chile, South Africa, Kenya, the Philippines. Whereas when we look at the other side of the graph, we'll see that Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Netherlands come the last when it comes to reporting high levels of concern on climate change. Of course, some of this may be unsurprising. For instance, we know that Chile and some African countries have historically shown high levels of concern about climate change. And it is, I guess, natural because some of these countries are already going through the negative consequences of climate change. Like, for instance, Chile had internal displacements due to a decade-long drought. Some African countries are already suffering economically because of changing weather patterns, droughts. So I guess it comes, for these countries, the level of concern to be high is quite normal. And we also have a minority that seems to disagree with this consensus that climate change is a very or extremely serious issue. When we look at the proportion of respondents who think that climate change is not serious at all, we find a minority across all markets. We find that only 3% say that climate change is not serious at all. However, we also observe that there are, of course, there's some variation across markets. We see, for instance, in the United States, 12% of our respondents said that climate change is not serious at all. This is higher than the average across all markets average. This is followed by Sweden, Greta Thunberg's home country, and Australia, which went through disastrous fires. So how can we make sense of some of these differences? Why do some people think that climate change is serious while others believe that it's not? One way of explaining this could be by looking at political alignment. And we asked our respondents where they see themselves on the political spectrum, either on the left, the center, or the right. And according to this, we looked at how concerned they were. And we realized that across all markets, generally speaking, the more left one sits on the political spectrum, the higher the levels of concern they seem to be reporting compared to those who self-identify on the right side of the political spectrum. And we see even starker differences in countries with higher levels of polarization, for instance, the US. If you look at the charts here, you can see that 89% of respondents who say that they're left-wing or they're on the left side of the political spectrum, they report that climate change is very or extremely serious. However, this is only 18% among those who say that they are on the right side of the political spectrum. We see a similar picture in Sweden, where both right-wing political actors and some websites seem to be pushing an anti-climate change rhetoric. So how can we understand the role of the news media in these sentiments, in these perceptions? One way of understanding is the first step of understanding is, of course, asking people which sources of news they use or they pay the most attention to, which is what we did. And then we analyzed this according to any differences between the various segments of the population. So, for instance, are young people more likely to use certain types of news sources more than older people? Or what happens when what can we learn when we divide our data according to those who are most concerned about climate change versus who are less concerned about climate change? So first, let's look at it in a more general sense. And when we do that across all markets, we see that TV is the most popular news medium, and we see that 35% of our respondents across all markets say that this is the news source that they pay the most attention when it comes to climate change news. This is followed by online news sites from major news organizations, and also specialized outlets that cover climate issues, including climate change. We also see that around 7% of our respondents say that they don't pay any attention to climate change. And we find that a really small minority say that they pay the most attention to printed newspapers as well as radio. But what happens, as I said in the beginning, what happens when we divide our data according to different age groups? In this chart, we divided our data according to 3 age groups. First is the Gen Z, 18 to 24-year-olds, and then 25 to 34-year-olds, and then we looked at the news habits of 55 plus. What happens when we compare these 3 groups? We first of all find that TV is the most popular among 55 plus, whereas we find that alternative sources such as social media posts and blogs seem to be quite popular among the Gen Z compared to the older generations. We also see that younger generations are more likely to pay attention to online news sites from major news organizations about news about climate change. We also asked some open questions about why some people seem to be attracted to alternative sources such as social media. And we wanted our respondents to explain to us in their own sentences. We found that, for instance, younger people seem to be attracted to following influencers like Greta Thunberg. We also saw that Leonardo DiCaprio seems to be popular. So these, especially the young, they seem to be looking for both authenticity and also diversity of opinions about this, because they also report, for instance, using smaller websites, smaller issue-specific websites that usually are not captured in surveys. But we also found, for instance, interestingly, traditional brands like the National Geographic seem to be finding a new audience via their visual Instagram and Facebook posts. So again, as I said, this was one part of the analysis. So we looked at younger versus older groups. And now what happens when we divide our data according to those who take climate change very seriously? So I'll call them just the concerned individuals, just for the sake of simplicity, versus the least concerned. Do we observe any differences? So in this chart, we are dividing them again into 2 groups. And what we find is that, first of all, 32% of the least concerned in the respondents report that they do not pay any attention to any climate change news. But those who do pay attention to climate change news, but they're still reporting low levels of concern, we see that they are less likely to rely on mainstream media. For instance, only 20% of these individuals use TV as their most used source on climate change news, versus 37% of those who are concerned seem to be using TV news for climate change. We also observed that only 8% of those who are the least concerned seem to be getting their climate change news from online news sites. So what do they use? They seem to be using alternative sources such as social media and blogs. And as well as that, they also don't seem to be very interested, also probably unsurprisingly, not very interested in specialized outlets covering climate issues. Finally, how is the performance of the news media? We wanted to understand what people think when it comes to how well the media performs in providing them with accurate information about climate change, and also helping them understand what they can do about climate change. So for instance, if you look at this chart, you'll see that there's again almost half of our sample across all markets on average seem to think that the news media does a good job when it comes to providing accurate information on climate change. But what happens when we again break down the data into two and look at those who are the most concerned, those who are concerned versus the least concerned about climate change, we see that those who are the least concerned, so those who say that climate change is not serious, not very serious, or not serious at all, they're more likely to report. 46% reported that the media does a bad job than a good job, which is only 16%. We also observe a similar finding when we analyze what the respondents say about how media performs in helping them understand what they can do. We again have a majority when you look at the whole data, when you analyze the whole data and just say, just analyze it, you see that half of the participants think that media does a good job. But then when you break down the data, those who are not concerned about climate change say that the media does a bad job, more likely to say the media does a bad job. So this brings us some key takeaways, I guess, that we can frame as challenges maybe, but you can also refer to them opportunities depending on where you see yourself. But for instance, some of these challenges is, of course, climate change requires scientific language, scientific content into a translation of scientific content into attractive contents, appealing content for a diverse audience. How do you translate the scientific language that, let's say, in a new research paper that says a very important finding, that how do you translate that into content that would appeal both to the young generation who are interested in this issue, but they also want authenticity and diverse views of points? How do you make sure that the least concerned, they pay attention to your news article or your news content or video? And how can you still inform them? We see that, as I said, the young generation, they're not as disapproving as of the mainstream media as other segments of the population, like partisans, but they also like using social media. They also like directly following activists and influencers on their social media sites. So actually there is a new avenue of competition for a news organization in that sense. How do you also appeal to the partisans who are also reporting low levels of, especially right-wing partisans? How do you appeal to those individuals, given that they seem to be rejecting the idea of climate change? They seem to be denying scientific evidence, but also they seem to have, in general, low trust in mainstream media. How do you make sure that these groups of individuals know the urgency of the issue? And how do you appeal to all these groups of people while also maintaining the trust in your news organization? It's not all grim, because the news media actually know the challenge, know that there is a challenge, and they're already taking steps to address these, maybe even turn them into opportunities in some cases. We know that, for instance, there is now a global journalism initiative that is called Covering Climate Now. They have more than 400 partners across the globe, and they're trying to improve the coverage of climate change. This is a great step towards just addressing some of these challenges I just mentioned. We also know that, for instance, some outlets are changing the language they use for climate change. For instance, some are not even mentioning climate change or emphasizing climate change so that they can appeal to more mainstream or more partisan individuals, whereas others, like The Guardian, for instance, they change the language from climate change to climate emergency just to emphasize the urgency of the issue. So I guess there's something positive going on in terms of the awareness of the challenge and in terms of taking steps towards addressing these. So I think I will just leave it at that and leave the rest for Q&A, which I'm looking forward to. And so thank you. And the full report is available here at the news site, digitalnewsreport.org. Thank you. Back to you, Federica.
I was muted. Yeah. Thank you very much, Simge. And while we wait for some questions, I have one myself. So you talk about how concern around the issue is aligned or has influenced by the left-wing, right-wing alignment. Is there also a strong then connection with highly polarized country, and do we see this in a particular way with aligning with polarization?
So could you repeat that? I'm sorry. Or
yeah, so you show a slide where you said, like, for example, the United States, there is, of course, the political alignment of people answering has as a weight in how they see, how concerned or not concerned, how the issue. Across all the countries that you saw, is there, then does it mean that there is a strong connection with polarization in countries, and therefore the split between concern and not concern?
Well, as I said, I mean, when we look at all the markets, all the markets that we surveyed, we see like slight differences between, but on average, slight differences between the left, center, and the right-wing respondents. But of course, when we look more specifically into markets where we usually, where we normally observe high levels of polarization, for instance, also Australia was one of them. Yes, we see stark differences, but this is not. These differences are not as big as you would expect in other countries that are not as polarized as the rest. If that does that explain?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. We got two questions about the countries covered. So we've been asked if Africa is covered in the survey, and if so, which countries, and similar about the Indian market.
In this year's survey, we have Kenya and South Africa. India is not covered in this year's survey.
Darren Chin asked, are there any differences in terms of socioeconomic status?
There are some slight differences when it comes to, let's say, income, but they're not that big, if I remember correctly. I have to check to be very clear about the percentages, of course, but in terms of education levels, there are, again, some differences between those who are reporting higher levels of concern versus lower levels of concern. There are some differences, so, but they're not as big as you would expect, I guess, on average. So we usually see high levels of education to have those respondents to have reported higher levels of concern. But again, as I said, it's not the biggest difference. It's around 10%, I guess.
We have another question from Marcus Halside. Is there not an issue with talking about the problem rather than talking about possible solution action that can be taken? If we can turn climate change into an opportunity rather than a problem, will there not be better reception from those who are less convinced?
That's a very good question. And I guess some news organizations are already doing this in certain ways. They are addressing the opportunities that come with climate change, and actually, for instance, changing the economy according to what we need for tackling climate change, like renewable energies, the opportunities, the employment opportunities that come with that. Or, for instance, I started seeing articles about wine production in climates that used to be inhospitable for wine production before, but this is due to climate change. So some news organizations, I guess, are trying to do that to a certain extent. And we also know that some of them are trying to get the attention of those who say that they're not concerned by emphasizing the economic costs of inaction. For instance, we know that in, let's say, in countries or in states that experience wildfires or floods, you would expect home insurances to increase, and that directly has effect on people. So some news organizations are actually trying to convince people that climate change has a direct effect on your savings by emphasizing these economic costs. But as I said, some of them are starting to emphasize the positive aspects of it.
And related to that, Julia Brunner asked, did you see a growing demand for solution-oriented journalism regarding climate change?
We don't really have much data on this because we didn't ask what people want to see on their news media, but in some of the open responses, our participants said that they don't want doom-laden, apocalyptic contents because they're just tired of seeing this, while others just blame the media for not being frank enough. So it seems that both the right and the left sides of the spectrum, people from both sides of the spectrum, criticize the news media for either being too doom-laden and negative, or not being frank enough about what's going to happen, which they think is an apocalypse. So it's really important that to find a balance, I guess, between those. Yeah, It's complicated.
Another question we have, one thing I have found interesting is that we have found in Afrobarometer is that the climate literacy and how much people actually know about it. Our data shows that only 55% of the survey respondents in South Africa are climate literate, which is cause for concern. Where do you think we should begin in building climate awareness as research institutions?
Wow, that's a very good question, but let me just try to think what we know from Kenya and South Africa. I don't know the questions about literacy, climate change literacy from Afrobarometer, unfortunately. But our understanding is that in these countries, some people are already quite affected by the consequences. So even if they don't know, let's say, the terminology around climate change or the details of the details of climate change, when they're asked with a simple question, they might still report concern over it. And as with regards to what should be done towards increasing awareness and literacy, honestly, this depends on, first of all, the country we're speaking of, and also the news organization. What kind of organization is it? Is it a multi-platform? What's the target audience? Is it a conservative target audience? Is it? It all depends on these dynamics that news organizations. So it's not a simple answer, unfortunately. But I hope this could guide, like, what's the platform like? What's the news organization like? What's the society like? The culture, news consumption patterns, all these should be integrated into deciding on that.
We have a question about Bangladesh that says, what is the impact of climate change in Bangladesh? And I just wanted to reiterate for everyone that in this case, we are talking specifically about climate change in the news, so not about climate change in itself as a scientific phenomenon. But I don't know if Bangladesh was included. Another question from Francis Hale. Have you seen correlation between the amount of coverage climate change has in mainstream media and level of concern in different countries? If so, do trends in news coverage follow levels of public concern or vice versa?
We don't have the data for that to run those analyses, but I know from other research, for instance, I think there's one from Cardiff University in the UK. They look at why there's now an increasing concern about climate change. If I'm not mistaken, I can find it later and send it, whoever is asking this question. But they ask, and what they find is that one reason is increasing publicity and media coverage. So people seem to be more aware of what's going on with climate change. Also, an increasing number of extreme weather seem to affect people's level of concern. So yes, in a way, in some research, some researchers find that media coverage and the volume of media coverage may be linked to increasing concern, but unfortunately, we don't have the data for that.
While we wait for more people to ask more questions, I have another question, which is, so you mentioned before how what different sources of news people get to get informed about climate change. Is there any correlation about how much people participate in online discussion regarding if they are concerned or not concerned?
Yes, so we looked at one way of participating in online debates, which is sharing news via social media or email. And what we found was, on average, when you look at across all markets, you see, on average, again, that more concerned people are more likely to share news on these platforms. But for instance, in Chile, where the concern is reported the highest, you see that the extremely concerned are the most frequently news sharing respondents also. But when you, again, look at highly polarized countries like the US or Sweden, you see the opposite. For instance, in the US, those who are the least concerned are as likely to share news on social media and via email as those who are concerned. In Sweden, even worse for the concerned people is that those who are the least concerned, so those who say that climate change is not serious or not serious at all, they are twice as likely to share news compared to those who are concerned. So there seems to be a relation, especially when you look at it from a polarization perspective.
Right. We have another question, which it's probably moving a tiny bit from the report, but so I'll see if you have an answer. I also want you to touch on climate justice or even intersectional and environmentalism. Do you think the media can play a role in championing this? And do you think that maybe now is the time the government should include such in informal education?
I can respond to some parts of it, I guess, by referring to some examples. We know that from other news organizations' experiences, especially younger people, they seem to be interested in climate justice and like social justice aspects of climate change. So some news organizations are responding to these by emphasizing human stories. So how are ordinary people affected directly by social justice that arises from social injustice that arises from climate change? I think there's one program I know of on PBS in the US that is called Peril and Promise. They seem to be having these segments. So there is, I guess, some sort of demands, and some news organizations are emphasizing this by responding with segments or documentaries or articles even that touches this issue.
There is another question about what sources of news. So would you say that podcasts could become specialized news outlet when it comes to independent climate change coverage?
We didn't have this data, unfortunately, but I guess it could be at some point, but we also need to think about how climate change is visual, and people actually like watching climate change news on TV because they like seeing the moving images, probably, of melting icebergs, melting glaciers, and like floods. Or I know it sounds really counterintuitive to watch your world get devastated, but it's the visual aspect of it that I think attracts many people to TV. It can also be, of course, a matter of habit. So if you somehow find an audience that is interested in listening to climate change, especially, I guess, with deeper insights into climate change, it could be again, about the economic aspects. It could be about social justice aspect. If you find an audience that is interested in listening to it, why not? I guess there's always potential.
Thank you. Is there any link to the inclusion of climate change issues in the primary and secondary education curriculum and the opinions of the respondents? I don't know if we have this data specifically in the report.
I'm sorry, we don't have that. We didn't ask that.
Have you looked into the spread of misinformation or fake news regarding climate change?
We didn't look at the relationship between yet, but this is, of course, we can look at, for instance, how people concerned about misinformation and how this is maybe linked to their reported levels of concern on climate change. But I guess it's a quite important topic because we see that, especially among those who are the least ones I refer to as the least concerned and the partisans, we saw in our open comments that climate change is a lie. It's all about control. Like, there were conspiratorial responses. And this makes sense because climate change has probably the best material for conspiracy theories and misinformation, given its past, especially between the conflict between groups of scientists, and it's a very important topic, but we haven't looked into it yet, I guess.
We have another question, which I'm not sure I'm understanding correctly, but when you talk about media, especially in Africa, is the focus commercial, mainstream, or community media, or both? I'm not sure if, David, if you are referring to what type of source of media people consume, or I don't know if Simge, if you understand this in a different way. Otherwise, David, can you maybe specify more what you mean?
I mean, we asked people to tell us which news source they use the most, they pay the most attention to when it comes to climate change. And we asked them to select one. And we had options like TV, printed newspapers, radio, online newspapers from major news organizations, alternative sources such as social media, and conversations with friends and family, as well as missing something, specialized outlets covering climate issues. So I don't know if that answers the question.
David, if we haven't answered your question, just write more in the chat, please. And another question, could there be any correlation to the low numbers in the Netherlands and the fact that the Netherlands have always been dealing with climate or flooding issues, and this is just a normal fact of life?
As I said, I don't want to speculate too much because, as I said, we didn't ask why people are either concerned or not concerned about climate change. So we just asked them to report whether or not they think climate change is a serious issue or not. But I guess that could be one factor. But another factor I can think of is maybe, again, I'm just speculating here. It's not in our data. But one reason could be right-wing websites or right-wing actors who are pushing for an anti-climate rhetoric. Another reason could be that maybe on average people in the Netherlands could have more trust in their states for tackling with the consequences of climate change. So they might say that, yes, climate change is an issue, but it's not that of a serious issue because my government can deal with it. Again, I'm just speculating. Maybe I should stop here.
A new question. Is there a difference between what platforms or sources people use for news in general and what people use for climate change news in particular? It is unusual that alternative sites are quite commonly used for climate change compared to more general news.
We haven't really compared the sources people use for other types of news with climate change news. So this is definitely a good idea that we should look into it. We specifically asked for climate change news, and it seems that for some people, they tend to, if they pay attention to it, they it seems to have differences between different segments of the population, especially, as I said, the concerned versus the not concerned. But we, as I said, we didn't look into that yet.
We have a question about a possible connection with coronavirus and climate change, but I know that the report, the data comes from before the coronavirus, so I don't think you have any updated data from since the coronavirus is spreading. Yeah,
unfortunately.
And David says that you have responded well. Thank you. He asked because urban audiences listen, subscribe to commercial media, while rural audiences who feel the impact of climate change more prefer community media. So that was where his question was coming from. While we wait for if anyone has more questions, I will have a last one from my side. In the last slide, you of course said what Newsroom can do about changing the language and be more solution oriented. Is there any risk that by going down of one of these paths, that some part of the audience might see as a campaigning, becoming a campaigning outlet, you either alienate the other side, or like, have you seen anything in relation to this?
I think there's a risk of going towards more campaigning style journalism, because as I said, the least concerned in our data, I mean, the ones who refer to climate change as not a serious issue, they tend to be right-wing and older, also male rather than female. But so these usually climate change, those who deny climate change at all, or those who are inattentive to it, but they're partisan, even when they hear the words climate change, sometimes they feel like that's a lifestyle that you're trying to impose on me, and I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to read your article. I'm not going to watch your TV segments. But that's why some journalists are trying a more, some TV or some news organizations are trying a more, how to say it, not objective, but a more, but a less climate focused language when they are trying to reach audiences like more right-wing, older audiences. But also, while you're doing that, are you losing younger generations who want more of an active language in your news article or your TV show? So it's a really challenging subject in terms of that. I mean, how do you both appeal to let's say a farmer in Missouri and also a young school striker in Sweden?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Challenging.
Yes.
We have a question which I'm not really sure is covered by the report, and as I mentioned, Simge of course is only speaking on behalf of what the data tell us about the relationship with climate change and news. It's asking about what do you think about government suppressive climate change news, which again, it's more like, do we have any data on censorship or any, like, where the countries stay on the spectrum?
No, unfortunately we don't. We only have some open responses that some of our participants spent the time to write, and some of them also complained about mainstream media not being frank enough, but we don't have anything else other than that, unfortunately.
Is there any evidence on the quality of engagement of people who access any particular form of media? For example, how deeply people engage with stories on TV, on social media and blogs, if it is just glancing over the news or an article?
Again, this is not, unfortunately, this is not covered in our data. We didn't have any questions about level of engagement. So I'm sorry.
Of course. I would like to know how the results of the online news sites were separated from the alternative ones in social media. That is, what segment the news consulted by news outlets in social media are in.
So in the choice of the responses, we specified online news sites from major news organizations like the BBC, for instance, whereas we said for the alternative sources, we specified as such as social media sites or blogs. And it seems to have made a difference, and so the respondents seem to have understood that pretty well.
Thank you. I don't see any more new questions, so I'm going to wait for one more minute to see if they ask us anything else, and otherwise I will wrap up the webinar. I think this is a good time to do a promotion for the Reuters Institute and say that we have done a podcast about the Digital News Report. So if you want to know, if you want to hear me and Simge talking more about climate change, you can find a chapter of an issue of the podcast, and we've covered with some of the other authors of the report some of the other aspects around local news and regional news, who pays for online news, newsletters. So you can find the report at the website address that you see on the screen, but also find us on Apple Podcast or Spotify, searching for the Reuters Institute, and you will find more about the report. And of course, all of these chapters also like separate chapters in the report, so you can consume that too. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much, Simge, to taking the time to explain to us this complicated topic. And thank you very much to everyone who stayed with us for this webinar. We will send you the slides and the video of this presentation once we finished. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simge.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.